Hello and welcome to the Temple Mount Podcast. I am Shogun, aka Ghost, and joining me today is my friend Eggbased for another in our weekly series of Friday conversations of topics of interest. We've covered masonry, we've covered esotericism and hermeticism. Again, major my bad on losing the masonry episode. It was excellent. Hopefully you were there to hear it live. If not, we'll hopefully revisit the topic in the future. Today's topic is ceremonial magic, a very interesting subject that Eggbase knows quite a lot about. So without further ado, please join us on the Temple Mount podcast, Discord server, YouTube, BitChute, etc. And welcome, Eggbase. Thank you for joining me. How are you, sir?
Hello. Yes, I'm quite well. Yeah, egg-based, also known by, I think, Dude Missile as Ovum Foundation. And yeah, so I'm excited for this one, actually, because again, as I mentioned earlier, I haven't spoken about this one at length in a while. And we'll certainly get back to, replacing that lost Freemason recording. But yeah, I'm excited.
I am also looking forward to it. Obviously, your knowledge and practice of this subject is much more extensive than mine. I did go through, and so for that reason, perhaps it wouldn't be out of place for me to briefly summarize, my limited experience with it, so that you can then build onto that and add to it, as I'm sure you will. So again, my experience of this was, as a teenager, more or less, very early and relatively early in my life at this point. I would read Aleister Crowley. I did the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram, somewhat separate subject, but I got into the chaos magic of Austin Osman Spare and sigil creation and charging and that kind of thing. And perhaps I might have even studied or things like Wicca and stuff like that. I don't think I really got into practicing that kind of aspect. And what I've come to understand later in life is that for me, magic, quote unquote magic, well, actually magic, no quotes needed, seems to be more of an intuitive process that happens in an instinctive way, as many things in my life do. I realize that is quite different than the systematic, initiatory, progressive process sort of implied by ceremonial magic. So, with that brief introduction, perhaps you can correct or elaborate on if that can even be considered an introduction, but
well, I would certainly like to start by addressing a few of the names that have been dropped already. The first is Aleister Crowley, and it is Crowley. I've been corrected on that a number of times. So that particular individual, who was referred to as Omega Therian and the Beast 666, widely regarded as the most evil man in the world, credited with such things as introducing the populist idea of anal sex. Generally not a fantastic role model, right? But the undoubtable conclusion is that this individual was remarkably well educated on subjects occult, and the particular flavor of his individual practice is holistically irrelevant. I don't think there are many sincere Crowley emulators to be found in the world. There are a great many who are enamored with this idea of becoming the supremely powerful beast or whatever, but in terms of the heritage and tradition that he engendered, it mostly surrounds the trend of scientific illuminism, which I will get into later. But I'd also like to address Austin Osman Spare, who was a very legitimate practitioner of chaos magic, which he defined very well and very relatably. And I used to actually do Sigil Saturdays, where I would teach the AOS sigil creation method. Now, of course, what you must also note is that most, quote, chaos practitioners, unquote, are simply vehement masturbators who insist on using their addiction to masturbation to charge sigils. Now, not to say that it doesn't work. It just creates, what was the term? At some point we were calling them cum gregors, So it's egregores that are formed purely out of like self-directed sexual energy, and they are generally like unidirectional and perverse. Um, AOS would certainly be disappointed with that, and sigils are a very potent and dangerous thing. You basically create a living extension out of a part of your soul as a seed, and then you empower it with external factors and energies pointed ideally in a coherent direction and with a like sound intent. But most people just kind of like throw some shit out there, and then they end up creating this living conscious being that is this sigil that becomes a servitor and then goes out and attempts to fulfill its purpose. And if any of you have seen Rick and Morty, you imagine Mr. Meeseeks, right? You press this button on the box, a Mr. Meeseeks pops up, you give it a purpose, and the Meeseeks does that purpose and then dies, right? And that's how you're supposed to use sigils, is you create a sigil and you give it a specific, measurable, realistic, and timely, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely goal, a SMART goal, and it goes out and fulfills that goal, and then once its measurable aim has been completed, it peters out, and its energy is returned, and you get the part of yourself back. The problem becomes when you create these sigils and servitors under a misdirected intent or a non-specific intent, and then you forget about them. And now you've just got all these conscious beings that you've created who are peripherally in your sphere of influence, who have no intention of dying because you haven't given them any criteria to fulfill. You've just kind of pointed this wind-up robot in a direction and continued subconsciously and incoherently charging it with energy. And it becomes just kind of this misdirected Energizer bunny that'll wander around the whole face of the earth for 1,000 years. And that's not ideal. And then you have the subject of the egregore, right? So you're familiar with certain hypersigils like the Golden Arches, McDonald's, the Starbucks image, right, which is actually considered widely to be Ishtar or Aztoreth. So it's it's regarded by the Goetia as a like supreme demon, right? And then everyone goes to Starbucks, and Starbucks panders the typical leftist Satanist ideology, right? So you have these hypersigils that are charged every time you can think of it this way. You get 10 practitioners to throw $10 at an egregore, right? And that egregore is now worth $100. You create a hypersigil and you get everybody to contribute half a cent to it. You get 10 million people to contribute half a cent worth of energy to this egregore, right? And then you have, what is that, $50,000, right? So you have this dilemma where no matter how strong the sigils you create are, they can't possibly hope to compete with these egregores that are the same thing. They're servitors created with no specific aim. But they're these massive thought forms. The Greek word aireioroi, which is spelled egregoroi, refers to the watchers in the Bible. And so the term egregore came to be because of that. But what it refers to in the ceremonial and occult tradition is some sort of unified form contributed to by everyone who views or interacts with it. And it's a thought form, right? So its existence is empowered by the belief in its existence. So this gets back to like the bronze serpent and the way in which, I forget the story, but the way in which the power of certain witches was removed in scriptures by going to a community and saying, put the thought of this person out of your minds, because the belief in their power was their power, right? And I believe that's a lot of where the demons in general get their power, is from much like the forces of chaos and Warhammer, it's the contributions that people make inadvertently with their inherent desires and corruptions and perversions. So those all get accumulated into these egregores that then proceed to be an evil completely out of the control of the original practitioners. And that tends to be the case in a lot of spiritual communities. You have to be very careful with it, almost deviously careful. Like, you have to assume that you are creating a thing which should not be allowed to live and treat it as such. Because even if it's good, the risk of it taking off and away from you is terrible. So you have to put like a kill switch in every one of these things. I want you to imagine that you create like a clone and you enslave that clone, but you put a fucking kill switch in its head. You put like a small explosive vial in its midbrain, and you have to be able to hit the button and just have it evaporate. Because the alternative is that you create a monster, right? And people do that every day, which is what fucking astounds me, is that people go and act on their basic knowledge before actually having any comprehension of its effects. Crowley predicted this, of course, which is why he's one of the world's most notorious gatekeepers. And there's a vast initiatic hierarchy to the depths of the knowledge that Crowley expressed, which requires reading a series of increasingly vague and secretive texts that are all written in symbolic shadow speak, and your explanation that you receive for them becomes progressively more coherent and comprehensive. So I think that's generally the way to do it, frankly. And people, harass me for gatekeeping all the time. Like, I had an invite-only community where we'd bring people in and basically make them justify their existence before we even gave them permission to speak. And the reason for that, of course, was that this was a tight group of practitioners. So that leads me into my next point, which is Gerald Gardner, who founded Wicca, with which most people are familiar. Gerald Gardner was a notorious pervert who invented Wicca mostly as a mechanism by which he could impress and seduce young women. You will notice, in fact, that trend has maintained itself, and that young, impressionable women from good families now become these witchy, or they describe themselves as like witchy bitches or whatever. And so you have like these high school aged women who are obsessed with this vaguely defined spiritual system that leaves them open to these just vast gaping traps of deceit and lies and abuse and seduction. So I regard Gerald Gardner as basically a fucking terrorist. I mean, like, he could have put a suicide vest on, walked into the UN, and exploded and done less damage than he did to society just by inventing Wicca. I mean, he's been exclusively responsible for, by my estimation, hundreds of demonic possessions, an untold number of cases of grooming and things like that. And Wicca is just this terrible disease of the mind. And of course, people will tell you, it's like, oh no, there's a witches, white witches, and they have their, secret spell books, and that's all fine, and they just do. It's like, no one actually follows the fucking rules, man. Like, you wouldn't become a practitioner of Wicca if there's probably, for every 1,000 people who identify with the witch label or the warlock label, for every 1,000 of them, there might be like 2 moral individuals who are actually trying to do the right thing, and they very quickly disavow the Gardnerian tradition and go in a direction that's a lot more consistently productive. So in review, Crowley's great because he produced a lot of useful information. He was generally a bad guy. AOS, Austin Osman Spare, was all right, misguided, chaotic, but the movement that he started has since been perverted into a simplistic method of affecting the world around you, and as a result you have basically just a bunch of guys in their sometimes they're mid-30s who are just like lonely virgins who are just like whacking it onto a piece of paper to try and earn themselves money or whatever. And then you have Gerald Gardner, who I unequivocally hate. I sincerely hope, out of any of the occult that I've ever reckoned with, I sincerely hope that Gerald Gardner is burning in hell. I can't state that unequivocally enough. I hope he's tied to a rock and that vultures peck out his liver, and it perpetually regrows. Like even pushing a boulder up a mountain for eternity wouldn't be good enough for him, or it would be too good for him, in fact. So that guy, I think I'm going to stop talking about.
Sure. Oh, well, you're well understood and your emphaticness about that. And I just, while you were talking, I looked this up. I didn't realize what this guy looked like, but I think people who are listening to you talk about it would find it interesting to see the picture of him there. That it's just kind of says it all right there in that picture, pretty much.
He's a rapey old man, like 100%. He's there's a friend of mine, Manny, who said he's a good guy, great guy, terrible babysitter. That's kind of how it is, right? It's like, oh, sure, like I bet he's wonderful at cribbage games or whatever. He's probably a real heartthrob around the retirement home. Who is that? Mr. Gladius, would you please do me a favor and close your microphone?
My bad.
Thanks, pal. No, it's no big deal. Thank you. So Gardnerian Wicca is just like this astounding perversion. And then you have the practice of witchcraft that came before it. So Gardnerian Wicca is just like this. I don't even know how to describe it. You ever been to anthropology? So any of you who live in America will be familiar with anthropology. Pologie. So it's I hesitate to. There's a word that people use around here in the Boston area, which I can't repeat because it involves a slur against women, but it begins with a C, and they describe this store as this E, right? And so it is basically this marketing ploy where you buy like a container of cacao that has like the Seed of Life logo on it, and it's labeled as ceremonial grade. It's like, well, what the hell does any of that fucking mean? And what it means is basically that it's marketed to the spiritually novice, vulnerable individuals who think that they're going to be saved from, all of their problems and the fires of damnation by, buying the right specific type of and putting it in their window so the sun hits it, or taking them all out and laying them on a full moon. I've talked extensively about crystals and their usefulness, but crystals are like pickaxes. If I owned a collection of pickaxes, it would no more make me a man rich in gold than if I owned a collection of Tupperware containers. Crystals are like this very specific thing, and unless you're making like effective talismans or you're deliberately charging them with very specific energies, and again, I state that magic, I don't believe I've actually said this, but magic is a concert of intention. And so Crowley was famous for saying that you can't stop doing magic, so you had better do it well than badly, which I think is profound. It's the idea that the extensions of your soul go forth and change reality whether you like it or not. So concerting your will surrounding that, and actually channeling the true will of your soul into intention that you then enact intentionally in a magical way. And I say that with like a CK, so we're referring to the practice. Not like, ooh, Harry Potter, wave my... There's a time and place for wand waving, but it's not to cast fireballs, you know what I'm saying? So magical is in like the practice of introspective relation to reality, and the attempts to use either archetypal representations and symbology to assist you in that, or literally, if you believe in such things, actual spiritual enclosures and entities, which have their own separate being and personhood and consciousness, and their own whatever origin stories and representation history. Or you could just express them as archetypes of the subconscious. And those are two very well-defined schools of thought, even at the highest levels of ceremonial magic. There are people who believe that you're just digging deeper and deeper into your mind and gaining more and more control over these mental phenomena. And then there are people who believe that you live in like a world of forms. And a lot of these forms are just separate, inaccessible personhoods who only relate to us through some sort of perception at the root of consciousness that can be accessed through meditation. But yeah, so the witchcraft that was practiced prior to Gardner was most often explicitly satanic, and this is where you get like cut wives and the women who would perform like sketchy, witchy abortion, would sell people poisons and lots of snake oil, and then the snake oil extreme subject in like the early 20th century. And then Gerald Gardner, of course, basically decided to attempt to codify this whole thing and create like a theme around it with the athame, the rule of three, and like all this fucking abject nonsense that basically was just a justification for do whatever the hell you want and just don't hurt anybody, which never stopped anyone. Like I really don't think, like I've never once met a self-identified witch or Wiccan who has not cursed outright at least one ex-boyfriend. So there is nothing beyond the level of superficiality and vanity, desire for power and agency to be had in Gardnerian Wicca. And I know I said I'd stop speaking about it, but that is a point, that is a hill that I will die on, like tomorrow. Like I will go up that hill and be shot trying to die on that hill. So anyway, but even in Gardnerian Wicca, you have ceremonial. You have this idea of performing very certain steps in a very certain way to achieve a certain desired effect. So there are two schools of thought on that as well, broadly speaking. Now, of course, there's actually like 7,200 or something. There's one for everyone who's gone past Da'at, right? But the issue that you encounter is that some people believe that these ceremonial steps are actually a well-calculated manipulation of universal forces. And then there's the people on the other side, the chaos magicians generally, who say that these ceremonial steps are part of a contribution to this specific belief. So like the lesser ritual of the pentagram, for instance, people argue that that's actually a descendant of the summoning of the element, which has been practiced all the way back to the Eleusinian mystery, or the invocation of the four, and things like that. Like that's a common history in mystery schools. But then on the other side, you have people who say that the lesser ritual of the pentagram, or that it only works because so many people have done it and believed that it works. So you're then, by doing this thing, you're tapping into it, you're bringing it upon yourself. And of course, I've found it to be one of the most remarkable steps that an individual can take in self-directed spirituality. It's unequivocally beneficial if done correctly and consistently and with the proper intent and the exact specificity with which the instructions should actually be followed. The banishing of 5 elements and the invoking of 5 elements is positively essential to preparations for further rituals, for any sort of enchanting or astral projection operation. It's just necessary because you don't realize how many are actually binding you down and preventing your intent from coming to fruition. And by freeing those out of the way, it's almost as though you open the conduit of the soul to project outwards through the human representation in the world. Whereas otherwise, you can imagine like a laser, and you've put a bunch of like sheets of very thin cloth in front of it, right? So by the time it gets through all the cloth, it's just like a dim light. But if you perform this ritual that moves all the cloth out of the way, then the laser beam goes from its emission point to whatever it hits in a straight line, regardless of distance. And that's a really amazing thing. It is. And I'll get into that and the effects that I've had with it at some point. But I think I've addressed a lot there. So maybe you could point me in the right direction.
Well, you certainly have addressed a lot. You made a lot of excellent points, and as always, explained things very well. Now, I'm cognizant that this is a conversation about ceremonial magic, and I have a personal interest that inclines me to go back to one of your earlier points, about egregores and that kind of thing, and something about my interest in that concept. But I'm also cognizant that could potentially be like a whole podcast, and so I won't try and change.
No. I can address that again briefly, but I definitely have an idea of other things I want to get into. But
right,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's part of the subject, and I mean, there's so many things I could respond to, and we'll ask eventually when you've covered what you want to. But I guess the question becomes for me, right? If one has not intentionally created an egregore or something of this nature, one has not necessarily done, sigil magic or anything of that nature. But as you say, these things can be done also, or are done all the time. I use the analogy of chaos gods in Warhammer 40,000 that are, we're creating these demons all the time by the things we think or feel or do or say or whatever. Which is something I take pretty seriously as an actual fact of life, although I'm not 100% certain on anything, of course. But the question becomes then, so if you haven't gone about some kind of formal process of creating some kind of tulpa or egregore or thought form, as you say, servitor or whatever, how would one then distinguish an entity that one is aware of? Or I guess what I'm trying to get at is are you aware as a practitioner of ceremonial magic or otherwise of a clear way to discern the category or nature of a spirit once one becomes aware of it, right? So if one becomes aware that a spirit is present, is there a way you're aware of to discern, is this an angel, is it a demon, is it an egregore, is it a servitor, is it a god, is it a goddess, is it something else? Is there some kind of, pH reaction test or something we can do equivalent to spirits other than, what the Bible suggests?
Yeah, so that's fascinating that you brought that up. So I interpreted it as two parts, which I'm going to address sequentially. The first is the ability to inadvertently create sigils and servitors, which every single one of you possesses. Now, of course, people get into like the schizophrenic depths of what constitutes a sigil. And I try to veer away from that, because once you get into that, every single thing that you write, say, think, draw, every form of art, every single commercialized label, I mean, it all is now a sigil. Like the shape of objects is now a sigil. So it's like you can say all that, I guess, but what does it, like if everything's a sigil, then nothing's a sigil, And I could argue that everything that's ever been produced in writing or imagery has had a strength of thought and a mental energy behind it, and that could, basically to equivocate, it could certainly produce a centralized force of energy around a certain datum, which then becomes its own being. However, I'm not really particularly a believer of the power of these things, because so many people who do these things, these deliberate acts like drawing and painting and shaping and writing, and have absolutely no potential metaphysical implications. That, for certain, affects against, right? It shortens the odds of people accidentally creating these things. So that leaves only the demographic of irresponsible practitioners who are inadvertently creating or maintaining sigils. The second point is, of course, how you interrogate, divine the nature of these spirits. There are a number of thoughts on this. I'm familiar with, let me see, three main ones. So the first is generally to go out of body and view it for yourself. Now that's very easy for practitioners of even intermediate experience. It's extremely difficult for beginners and should not be attempted, for the record, because if in fact this entity is of a negative or hazardous nature, removing your awareness from the body will put you further at risk unless you know what you're doing. You'll find me saying that a lot, and this is where people get pissed about the. Well, if you know what you're doing. The first one is just to look at it, just to look at what it is, and that extends to perception, right? Like, how is it affecting your mental state or your environment or the feelings in your body, your way that you think? How is it affecting all of these circumstances while you're in its presence, right? And that's a good one. That works just about 90% of the time. There are very few things that can actively conceal their nature from active perception. However, there are the 10% that absolutely can. So in that case, I generally go to step 2, which is the Crowleyan and Goetic, Clavicula Solomonensis method, which is basically to assert your dominance and then to insist that it present itself as its true form and declare its intent. And you can usually even get its name by doing that. And so the typical one is I, so-and-so. Sometimes I use my true name, the one on the white stone. I say that, I demand unequivocally that thou presentest thyself as thy true form, and deceive me not, lest ye be banished to the farthest depths of torture and imprisonment, under the grace of the one true, holy, and almighty God, and that ye may be remanded to the infinitude of, what's the word I use? Neglect and abandonment. You may be relegated to the infinitude of neglect and abandonment, never to be seen or heard from again, that no knowledge of thy existence may ever persist in the minds of men or of angels, forever and ever, so mote it be. And I don't get any negative responses to that, really. I mean, and if I do, then I start further invocation. So I start with the 16 initial names of the Shem. I start with the invocations of angels, powerful spirits, godhoods. I start channeling omniscience, and once you get to that, anything that doesn't vibe, like anything that doesn't do what you want, you've already invoked enough shit that you can just fucking kill it. Like, oh, never mind. Okay, you don't want to play ball? Die. And generally, the things which resist you that actively are so parasitic and corrupt that removing them from existence is actually a service to the Lord. Now, of course, that's only the second method. The third, which I disavow entirely, is generally to try negotiating and say, like, well, I'm just trying to ascertain this and that, obtain this and that power, and what do you want for it, and I'll give you these things. The only responsible way to do this is to actually bring bread and salt and say, like, I've brought you bread and salt to appease your nature, that ye may accept an offering and comply with my will. And then you proceed with threatening them afterwards. That doesn't work. But most spirits in good grace will accept even the most basic of offerings. Like, you could take a fucking slice of Wonder Bread and sprinkle a little salt on it and say, now do what I want. Probably about half of them will just take that and run with it. And then, of course, you take the slice of bread and the salt and you throw it into a fire or throw it down a storm drain or anything. But certainly don't keep it around or put it in your trash can, but because now it's got a spirit in it. But that third one, people go pretty far with it, and that's where you get people offering their firstborn to Hasmodai, or it's like, okay, pal, like, have you considered just not doing that? Like, really, have you approached the idea of just not doing that? But the true nature of beings is as fundamental to the practice of ceremonial magic or even just practical spirituality in any wise. It's as fundamental to that as the ability to distinguish between your own thoughts and the perceptions of the mind or the spirit. Those two faculties, pardon me, those two faculties are precisely the most exceptionally necessary. Because if you don't know who you're speaking, then, what is it, right? If I don't make an introduction, I'm pretty sure I'm not even speaking to a man. This person could just be a boy or, like, they don't mean business, right? So if I can't establish a dialogue with somebody, especially from like a sales perspective, I'm not really doing business with them. Like, if I can't introduce myself and get their name as well, then, we're not on even footing, and I do not appreciate that. So I make pretty immediate demands, and if I even have the slightest doubts, my general go-to is pronounce Yeshua HaMashiach. Pronounce it. Pronounce it thrice. And if there is any being or spirit that will not confess that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, then I'm just like, all right, so we're going to skip straight to the thumb screws then. Like, you had your chance. Sorry, pal. But, like, whatever tortures I can are worse than the ones that you come from. So if you won't pronounce that Christ is Lord, we're an issue. And that, like, they're people. They're convincible. You can negotiate with them. You just shouldn't come from a negotiating position of offering them things. You should come from a negotiating position of subjugating any potential harmful individual. And that's basically the whole, is that, like, at some point you have to put like a silver ring on your left hand face so that you're not instantly killed, and you have to not violate the boundary. But as long as you conform to those things, you're in charge, and, like, unless you fuck it up, you basically are in the supreme position of power in that case, at least in that finite interaction. Now, of course, God is in the supreme position of power, but you are the prime negotiator, right? You've instigated the conversation. You're asking all the questions. And that's sort of the basis of ceremonial magic, is you need to know who you're speaking to. You need to know what you're invoking and why and what purpose it serves. Mm-hmm. And then the other one is the ability to distinguish, preferably originally in a state of meditation, the difference between self-generated thoughts and external stimuli that approach the mind or the consciousness. And until you can do that, you can't accept signs, messages, you can't interpret dreams, you can't do any of that, because you have no idea what actually revealed to you. Those two things are fundamental, and they're basically your map and your compass. It's like, how do you get around where external disembodied spirits exist? Well, you have to know how to talk to them and how to ascertain their nature and identity. And then you have to know how to listen. And you have to be able to listen very intentionally in a state of meditation. That's generally the one that people get hung up on, because they can't distinguish it from hearing fucking voices in their head. And what I generally say, or not, then something is desperately, desperately wrong and needs immediate. Like if they're not speaking only when spoken to, you fucked up somehow. And that's kind of it regarding the question of the nature of spirits. So,
a good and thorough answer, detailed. However, given that you emphasized repeatedly how absolutely essential this is, perhaps I'll presume to ask one more follow-up question before we can go on to whatever else you want to talk about ceremonial magic. But so what you're describing is interesting, and somebody's mic is echoing. I guess maybe it's yours, but but I'm aware that it also hasn't really resolved my conundrum for me, because as you're aware, I'm pretty regularly in interaction with at least two, if not significantly more, pretty consistent spiritual entities in my life, and it's still not clear to me how I can definitively categorize them into one or another class of beings, such as demon, angel, or otherwise. And certainly they have told me their names or various names that they use for themselves. They haven't, refused to provide a name for me. They've told me their names, without me having to thumbscrew them or anything of the sort. They seemingly chose to reveal those things to me, sometimes sequentially, like multiple names over time, until it was a complete name that emerged over time. But none of them correspond to any of the names in something like the Ars Goetia. None of them are known demonic or angelic spirits, with the possible exception of this being who may or may not be called Anath, who apparently is a pre-existing goddess entity. But it's not entirely.
I'm still very sketched out by that, by the way.
So am I, and that, as I don't know how much of the details of it but the more of it you do, the more sketchy it is, and bizarre it is. And again, so a little bit about my journey of this. Of initially, like you brought up, the egregores and tulpas and how people can create them intentionally or unintentionally, and that was, as I said, my first instinct about what these beings were, was that I had created them intentionally or unintentionally, not formally. I didn't do it formally in a magical way, but certainly I have powerful, as you said, we all do, whatever intentions, actions, emotions, etc., psychic energies, whatever that could coalesce in my thinking into one or more of these entities, but they would be created by me. But what has kind of nixed that proposition is that they have revealed things to me that I later verified to be true, but which were completely not things that I knew. Like, they're not things I ever had heard before. And these entities accurately relayed this information to me about themselves or about other things, and seem to indeed be able to bestow upon me numerous forms of gifts and assistances, such as actual physical objects, information, protection, guidance, etc.
Right, and as a result, you've let them into your home and control over part of your psyche.
Yes, or I couldn't prevent that even if I tried, which is a thing I can't quite figure out, because, like...
Right, so that makes me shudder, like I shuddered. Okay? So the way I see it, there are three distinct possibilities, given what you've told me. Now, I'm entirely neglecting the possibility that they could be angels, because if they were, they would not make any of these. They would not attempt to ascertain control.
You're having a little bit of a mic in and out issue, and I want to hear everything you're saying. So could you just repeat this from the beginning, if you don't mind? And if there's anything you can do to...
Please let me know if it continues.
I shall.
Okay. I think I had my finger over the bottom of my phone. May well not have helped. But so I'm completely nixing the idea that they could be angels, because angels do not behave in this way for a multitude of reasons. They would not attempt to obtain control over you, household, or any part of your will. They generally would not provide you in a forward-looking manner with abjectly preternatural knowledge, unless it were relevant to the aims of God or to the preservation of your soul. That's not to say that they would never give you gifts. but that you just wouldn't, it wouldn't be like minor.
Cut out there for a second, just so you know.
Right. It wouldn't be like minor curiosity. Second, so I see three possibilities. They're either demons who are deceiving you, which I'm inclined to believe. Angels, by the way, they'd give you their names directly, and you would then be able to go and translate them from Hebrew or Aramaic if they were not already well-known angels or principalities, powers, thrones, watchers, seraphim. If you couldn't already distinguish them from that category, you could derive their names from the divisions of the Shema Mepharash, or you could just translate their names directly from Hebrew or Aramaic. Generally, they'll give them to you in Aramaic. You have to actually work pretty hard at trying to figure out what they mean if it's an angel that you can't just look up on. But I personally believe that they're probably demons who are deceiving you because they've taken over a part of your household, and they've attempted to ascertain to a certain degree how your mind operates and how much they can push it and how much control they can take. That's typical. That's typical of spirits that are establishing themselves in the direction of demonic obsession, which is an extremely scary thing. It's the reason I'm shuddering.
Well, right.
The second possibility, as I understand it, is that they are human spirits, right? Who have gravitated to you because they anticipate that you will serve some sort of purpose as a psychopath, and then they will become the Grateful Dead, right? You serve. I really am having a mic.
Yeah, it's getting worse now, unfortunately.
That fucking sucks. Here, so I'm just going to. How about now? Can you hear me now?
You're coming in perfectly right now. Yes.
All right. So I turned off auto sensitivity because
Extremely-
I'm.
Sorry.
Well, I anticipate that I'll be the only one speaking, so I turned off auto sensitivity for now. But, all right. Well, so long as you can hear me,
I can.
then what I'll begin to relate. My light is just turned off because it's actually gotten too hot. You imagine the electrical resistance in a fucking LED light fixture. But anyway, so the second possibility I anticipate would be these, again, human spirits who are disembodied either by, they're either vengeful or unsettled, or they have business still to complete, or they simply don't have enough peace to pass on. And they anticipate somehow that you will provide them with that or serve, again, as a psychopomp. That is to say, an individual who's capable of elevating disembodied spirits into a restful state, or, the spaces above, right? The higher spheres. That's a second possibility, and in that case, you need to accept responsibility for addressing their problems directly instead of merely comforting them, because that is a toxic cycle that will lead to a codependent relationship, and then it will even make them more reluctant to leave and move on.
Right.
So that's one.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, if you weren't finished, I didn't want to interrupt you.
So the first possibility is that they're demons. The second is that they're human spirits. The third and most fascinating option, I believe, is that they're divisions of yourself that you've created, and that they're actually parts of you that you feel the need to include in your life and your living space, because they're actually divisions of the self that you've created through one of the many incidents that could have created a fragmented personality, and that they're archetypal representations of parts of you that you're out of touch with. And in that case, the solution would be to attempt to merge with them as holistically as you can, by just accepting the messages, right? And attempting to apply them to a healthy, self-critical narrative, like not immediately, going and criticizing yourself for anything, but just looking at what they represent and their drives, desires, purpose, and nature, and trying to figure out which part of yourself that reflects and how to heal that. I think that may well be the case, based on what you've told me. because it seems to be that they're providing you with things that could be part of your knowledge and simply are not, that are relevant, but that are not explicitly messages from one side or the other. It seems to be fairly internal, and human spirits generally do not provide extensive preternatural knowledge, especially not without being interrogated to that effect. So that's my opinion.
It's a fascinating and very valuable answer. And again, this was why I was both hesitant and unable to prevent myself from going down this road of conversation, because I recognize it would probably take us substantially into this. But I just have to say that as excellent as your answer was, it has simply, kind of, not simply, it is, unfortunately, it's confusing, because all three of those explanations make a lot of sense to me for a lot of different reasons. And, so it's all three of those could very easily be understood to me to be the case. And I have very good reasons to suspect the second in specific, that these are actually ghosts, because that's one thing that's been, very clearly revealed to me, is that some of these, I have a lot of interaction with the ghosts, and there's a whole story that we'll get into later. So there's a lot of reasons why that makes sense to me. But then again, that could also be part of the first explanation, that demons have been known to pretend to be dead human spirits, right? Because they're deceptive by nature, and so even a ghost could be a demon pretending to be a ghost, which complicates the issue. I agree with you that they're certainly not angels in the conventional sense of the word. That's pretty clear to me. Unless perhaps one of them is the proverbial guardian angel, which I'm not sure how literal that is in ceremonial magic, is an actual angel in the Hebrew sense of the word or whatever. And then the third option is very clearly part of the truth. But I'm not sure can be the whole truth. So, point is, I'm not going to prevail any more of your time. I am glad I got that answer from you, because it was a good one. But it is.
Well, let me relate it back into the subject so that you feel less bad about having occupied space in this conversation, because I certainly agree that you should, and the value of this subject is in actually providing a reference point for the way in which it addresses certain incidents. Because I could talk all about the practices, but actually having the two of us engage in a dialogue over how it should be done is very valuable, and this would be a great teaching moment if I had students in the room. Not that I'm taking students anymore, but what I will say is that if they're demons, you can banish them. You just put them back right where they came from. So I would recommend starting with that, because banishing demons is fine. Rectifying the energy in a space will not remove human spirits. It can remove their presence temporarily, but it will not remove them. I mean, if they've decided that they want to bring their message to you and have you resolve it, then they will come back. But it will rid you of demons. So I would recommend picking 3 of the major open areas in your house and using the pentagram of the earth, as in starting from the bottom left corner and ascending to the top, and proceeding in that clockwise direction. Using that pentagram and the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram in about 3 of the, just whatever 3 largest rooms in your immediate vicinity are, or 2 or whatever. If you only have 1 large room or 2 large rooms, then do that. But try that first. If they're human spirits and you are interested in divining whether or not that's the case, then you should light a candle, all right, and then carry it from the furthest extent of your home or dwelling, the furthest extent away from the door, right? Close all the windows, open all the internal doors between all the rooms and all the closets, light a candle, and illuminate every square foot of the entire joint. All up and down the inside of the closets and the walls and around the windows, and do that just briefly. You don't have to like sit there and burn the candle slowly against every square inch of the thing, but just like wave it generally around and do that progressively towards the door of your home, right? Cover every room, all the closets, the bathroom, everything. And then open the door, walk the candle outside, put the candle down, close the door, and count to about 10, and then go out and extinguish the candle. And boom, done. Any and all human spirits that were previously in your dwelling will have vacated. Now, third in line, of course, if neither of those is the case, and if you still have these presences here, then they came from you. You either created them or they fragmented off of you in some way due to some unforeseen circumstance. If that is actually what's going on, then that, I could imagine, would be the most laborious outcome, because you are now not only responsible for their rectification, but also responsible for their existence in the first place, which is another process which you have to divine your way through and attempt to reconcile. So those, I hope that clears at least some of that up and does not provide additional confusion, because you can divine the nature of these spirits by process of elimination. That's what I was going to entail earlier that I neglected. I was going to entail it earlier, but neglected to do so. That is, in fact, the most effective method for actually quantifying the entire nature of being, is just doing everything that would get rid of everything else. And if it's still around, then there you go. But if you want to do it and still interact with it, then you have to do one of the three aforementioned steps, which, viewing it, or making demands of it, or attempting to establish a dialogue or a negotiation with it.
Right. So I had the same thought as you, that the best way to approach this, or what I concluded as well, was process of elimination. And like you said, trying to do everything in order of, priority, because obviously, as far as I can understand, probably the worst outcome, maybe you can correct me if you see it differently, of what you're talking about, the possibilities would be these are demons, because it would mean I have at least two persistent demons that are personally attached to me and connected to me, and that would seem to be the worst of the outcomes. The ghosts, in my impression, has been that they're friendly, or whatever. That would be less of a priority. I'm not afraid of ghosts, you know what I mean? And so whether or not it's potentially harmful them to be around me, I don't.
I ain't afraid of no ghosts.
Yeah, I mean, my ex-wife was horrified of ghosts. I am not at all afraid of ghosts, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't be potentially negative for them to be around. But obviously, as I said, I haven't practiced any kind of magic in a formal sense since a very long time ago, other than the sporadic lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, perhaps once or twice a year for whatever reason it happened to come up. Not even that often, I'm sure. But what I have tried, and I know you're also a Christian, this is something I want to talk about later, perhaps in a broader sense as it pertains to ceremonial magic. But we also have teachings in the Bible about how we can test spirits, as you mentioned earlier, whether or not they will confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh, as my translation has it. Saying the name of Jesus Christ, or Yeshua HaMashiach, as you suggested. We're also told that Christians are supposed to have the authority to cast out demons and trample over the power of serpents and scorpions and powers of the adversary, etc. So that's the approach I've been taking, is more the Christian approach. And so I'm wondering if you have an opinion on whether what I've done is perhaps lacking, because I haven't tried a ceremonial magic approach. I haven't tried what you're talking about with the candle. But what I have done is prayed repeatedly, right, telling these beings they have to leave in the name of Jesus Christ, or any unclean spirit, any demon, any spirit of Antichrist, spirit of the devil that's around me, I renounce it in the name of Jesus Christ. I eschew or rebuke any connection I have to any such thing in any way, shape, or form. And I've tried hundreds of variations of that concept of a prayer, right? And I've also, taken communion, and not that that's a method of exorcism or anything like that, but perhaps it could function in that way in some sense. And I've even had priest or my own pastor do like a deliverance ministry with the explicit intention of breaking or banishing the power or presence of any demon or unclean spirit. And that, as well as anything else that I've tried, including just straight up telling them to leave or they can't come back, has not worked. And not only that, they have repeatedly expressed to me that it will never work. Like they've told me straight up, you cannot get rid of us. Like we're not going away. And whether that's true or not, because a demon might say that and be deceptive, that's been the case. So I'm wondering, do you think that would rule out by process of elimination that these are indeed demons? Because that's sort of where I'm coming to now, is that like these probably aren't demons because, as you said, they've stuck around through what I understand should
Yeah, hold on. What are they calling themselves?
Like names, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I've been told, whether I should believe it or not, obviously, is still in the context of this conversation something I should be agnostic about. We've been told not to reveal only one of the names that have been revealed to me, and that's very unusual for me, right? I'm not the kind of person who says, I've heard certain people say, oh, this information is classified, or I'm generally an open book about virtually everything, as it probably to a fault, you know what I mean?
Well,
But
I'm going to encourage you not to keep the secrets of your household imps from me. But if you feel that that's a requirement, then please do
well,
as thou wilt, you know?
it's unclear to me whether or not I should respect that. But you know, anyways, one of them I have referred to, and again, these are beings that are in my life present themselves as familiar friends, right? Whether that's true or not, they present themselves to me at all times as familiar friends, like with positive interactions with me that seem to be mutually beneficial or enjoyable to both sides. Is how it presents, right? But it may not be the case in actual fact. But one of them basically uses the moniker Rose, and the other one uses the moniker Angel, essentially. But the one that refers to itself as Angel has since revealed to me a full three-part name, first, middle, and last, and requested or told me not to reveal the middle name. So whatever I make of that. And again, this is why it's so perplexing to me, because these beings do not have, like, that's not something I would say to myself. You know what I mean? You were talking earlier about being able to distinguish your internal monologue or dialogue or whatever thoughts from external things. Like, you know, it's talking to me like it's something different than me. It's telling me things that I wouldn't ask myself. Like, this is a name that I've never used or thought about or associated any significance with, but I'm going to tell it like that I have Anna's ghost, but they're telling me this is their name, and it's like coming out of the ether, right? And then they're making like requests or requirements of me, like, don't tell anyone this name, which, you know, as I said, I wouldn't. That's not my personality. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm further disturbed, and I'm now leaning more to that first option. And it's okay, Shogun. We've all had a house imp here and again, but I have personally never offered them room and board, so I think you may have made a sincere mistake. I'm going to hesitate to invoke my authority and just be like, well, you need to tell me this thing, because if it's a thing and you don't address it, then I have to. And I maintain that I very well could. However, I'm not going to do that out of respect for your, agency, etc. I will encourage you to reveal said information to me, because a spirit that has insisted that you keep its secrets is probably less trustworthy than any other kind. However, if you feel that you have an obligation to this, but what I would encourage you to understand is that a spirit that is attempting to engage in this power dynamic with you is probably trying to establish itself as a valued part of your life that you will develop some sort of attachment or dependency on, and then will make increasingly damning demands, or become increasingly negative as you begin to refuse things. And that would be very typical of sort of the medium grade demons that are commonly inhabiting households and such things. So I'm just, warning you of that. Now, I'd like to quote Teos, which I'm very, very hesitant to do, mostly because of my inability to remember many of the valuable things that he says in their original phrasing. But he said that the lesser grade of demons do not know the name of Christ. the middle grade of demons fear the name of Christ, but the highest grade of demons laugh at the name of Christ. I believe is how he put it. And now I may be completely bastardizing the order of operations there. And I hope he'll correct me when we go to questions. But the point, in fact, is that the reaction that you get from these demons is entirely dependent on their attitude towards your agency and towards your faith. So I would recommend first that rather than immediately jumping to the lesser banishment ritual of the pentagram, start with frankincense, myrrh, and holy water. And if you can't get frankincense and myrrh, then just do holy water. And you could, of course, ask this church person of yours, I don't know if you call him a priest in Anglicanism, but you could, of course, ask them and say that I have spirits in my home. Can you help me? I don't know of anyone who is ordained and who is pastoral or not pastoral, but diocesan, or as in part of a diocese. I don't know anyone who would refuse that. They'd probably be very urgently aware of the necessity of that operation. So you could start there, of course, and then you could try and take matters into your own hands after that. But
right.
If they're unclean spirits, then asking them nicely and praying may not really do it. You would hope that it would, but at the same time, you don't hold contempt in your heart for them. You were asking for unclean spirits to go, but they'll deny to you to their very end that they're not unclean, even if they're only, even 30% of the way up the chain to the dukes and presidents and everything. But,
right.
yeah, you need to be very concerned about that, my friend, and I cannot express that fully enough.
That's precisely why I've felt the need to, take this, because this has been one of the, if not the primary concern that's been on my mind for quite some time. But I'm wondering if I could contribute just a few points of information and see if it is relevant to you. One is that the request to conceal that particular name, which was the last part of the name that was revealed to me during a very intense series of spiritual experiences, or whatever you want to call it, relatively recently, and a whole bunch of crazy stuff came about as a result of that and after that, and it's very bizarre, and we've talked about it to some extent, and I won't go into the details now for brevity, so much as I can ever manage that these days. But
that is to say, not at all.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. But the only that's the only request that's ever been made of me, other than simply my friendship or companionship or whatever it is, right? They've never asked me for anything, right? And everything I've ever, quote unquote, given to them or done from them has never been requested or demanded in any way. They've never, made any requests or demands of me, other than actually, arguably, simply to continue to allow their presence, right? If you consider that a demand, but that hasn't been expressed in the form of a demand. It's just been a recurrent fact. You know what I mean? So they've never made any demands of me other than that one particular. That was only one of the two entities. Although I've questioned sometimes if it could be the same entity pretending to be two different entities. Anything seems to me on the table in this situation. So I'm trying not to rule out any possibilities prematurely, given, as you said, the potential extreme spiritual ramifications, which I've been well aware of. But I agree with you in emphasizing it. The second point, the first again being that no other demands have ever been made to me in any formal or literal or observable sense. The second is that I have put them both repeatedly to the question that you mentioned, which is, do you testify that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh, which the Bible says unclean spirits will not do? I don't know if you think there's caveats to that or not. Now, they repeatedly did testify this, but there's a little asterisk there. So they would say, yes, we testify that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. But at least in the one case, there was still a lingering sense that they weren't entirely convincing, but they did indeed say it repeatedly when asked to. So I'm not sure if either of those facts sway your assessment in any way.
Now, here's what you have to understand. My knowledge of the fundamentals of this discipline is coherent and extensive. But anyone who's going to tell you that they have a comprehensive understanding of these phenomena should probably be put up against a wall and shot, because that's like such a radical bastardization of the nature of truth. It's like no one actually really knows fully what the fuck they're talking about, least of all me. I mean, like I am chief among morons regarding the absolute truth of the universe. You know, I mean, like there are few people who know less about the truth of the universe than someone who will tell you they know something about the truth of the universe. And as a result, I feel that I can contribute whatever has come of my understanding. But there are things, there are more things on heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, right? And so I really can't hope to give you a definitive answer on these subjects. What I can say is that you can check off a whole bunch of boxes that really narrow down your options for the identity of these things. And, you know, I can't tell you whether or not there are demons powerful enough to say deceptively that Christ came in the flesh. I don't imagine that it's out of the realm of possibility that they could lie so greatly as to say that in a deceitful and spiteful way. You know, much in the same way that I believe Mormons who offer their testimony of Jesus Christ are doing so in a selfishly motivated and bastardized way. You know, that's possible, I guess. I don't want to say that it's definitively possible, but again, you know, I can't say here or there on that. Especially if you say you're not convinced. Right? And, you know, if they're human spirits, they could be dead Jews. You know, so they'll say Jesus came in the flesh, but they're not going to say that he was the Messiah. You know? So I don't even know what to do with that, man. Like, it's somewhere in there. And you definitely should ask them. And if they tell you, then that's something. It disqualifies a whole category of beings. But I don't think that necessarily gives you a whole lot of information as to what it is. You know, you could check off 62 billion things that it is not, but you still wouldn't even have the one that it is, because there's an infinitude of possibilities here. So, personally, I think that if they're occupying your home and asking you to keep their secrets, then they're immediately sketchy and you should fucking get rid of them by any means necessary. I think that any positive relationship you're beginning to establish with them is almost certainly illusory, and that it's playing directly into the vulnerability of your, I don't want to say that you're gullible, because you're not, but your curiosity is a vulnerability. Your willingness to explore certain paths and opportunities is a vulnerability. And they could very well just be taking advantage of that, because they're far smarter than you or I. They've lived vastly longer. And I'm not a true and perfect representation of my soul. If I was, then I could outsmart them, but I'm not. So I don't know. I don't know. My advice would be to get them the gall darn heck out of your dwelling place. That would be my advice.
Mm-hmm. And how to do that? I mean, you suggested I could ask my pastor to come and actually pray not over me physically in the flesh as he has done, but actually over my home, which is something I could ask him to do. I mean,
have your home blessed.
Mm.
If it doesn't work, then banish. If that doesn't work, then do the whole psychopomp thing with the candle. And if that doesn't work, then you're left with parts of yourself. And I think that really could be the most difficult of them all, because all of a sudden they're not enemies, they're not annoyances. They're actually unreconciled divisions of your personhood. And that could potentially be the hardest work that's on the table. So,
and on that point, and perhaps in support of that hypothesis about what these beings are, one of the big personal realizations that's been really profound to me, and I've been talking about with Teos and some other people quite a bit recently, has been indeed to integrate these two beings. I ultimately came to the conclusion, which may or may not need to be revisited, right? Because as you say, there's certain warning signs or things that to be concerned about, but is that I'm ultimately wasting energy by constantly interrogating these beings, being suspicious of these beings, trying to banish these beings, because ultimately I came to understand them as essentially integrate them as my left and right hand, whether metaphorically or literally, and to realize that both of them are indeed, as they have always claimed and represented themselves, my allies and even my tools or weapons. And I started to think what I've been doing here is equivalent to bashing my own swords together to try and get rid of them when I'm supposed to be wielding them as extensions of my will. And so one of the advices that was given to me by other members in the similar vein of conversation was if they won't leave when you try to get rid of them and you can't get rid of them, then you need to just give them jobs and figure out what their role and purpose is and assign them to that purpose. And so that's where I've kind of come to with it. And like I say, symbolically or literally interpreting them as my left and right hand, both in sort of a magical sense of the left and right hand path, but also in like a literal sense of my left and right hand and the two hemispheres of my brain and the animus and anima and the yin and the yang and all these kind of concepts of integration or what you might call shadow work or whatever. And essentially the easiest way to summarize it would be that, and under that template, angel would be my higher nature, my guardian angel, and Rose would essentially be the shadow self who has to be integrated and utilized because it can't ultimately be removed from a Jungian point of view, right? That somewhat seems to be the most productive avenue so far, but again, like you say, it's important enough that I'm willing to do anything to be as certain as possible. You know what I mean? For the reasons that you've explained. I don't think I have access to holy water. I don't know if my pastor can give me that or not. I could certainly get frankincense and myrrh, but I'm not sure if you elaborated on precisely what to do with that.
So there's another option that I didn't offer to you immediately because I didn't want to just instantly insert myself into your conundrum. But I have both the knowledge and the capacity to just fix this immediately. And the only things that I couldn't possibly remove from your home are things that you have internally and subconsciously put there. That is to say, parts of your own being that you're making, allocations for because they're parts of you and whose identities you could only confirm by, further attempting to reconcile yourself with them. But I, from right here in Massachusetts, could very easily remove any and all spirits from your home in Winnipeg, practically by snapping my fingers. So this is the part where I get into bloviating, and this is the reason that I was more than happy to go off on this secondary discussion of your particular situation, because the next part of the discussion about ceremonial magic was going to be my experience with it, which necessarily entails me doing a whole lot of talking about how wonderful and fantastic I and everything that I've ever done really am and is, right? How wonderful and fantastic I am and how wonderful everything I've ever done is. And all of the very profound ways in which I've been able to affect reality and all these great spirits and confined equations that are all numerologically coherent I've been able to leverage in a ceremonial way. And the ninth density enclosures that have been able to exact my will on my behalf. And that all, I think, really, from a position of humility, could go entirely without saying. So I think I'm more than happy to leave that there. But the point is, basically, that you'll have to take my word for it. I could very easily solve just about every aspect of this problem other than the one in which it is the case that you have put these spirits inside your home by creating extensions of your own spirit, which would be why that'd be the only reason why you actually could not get rid of them. Because otherwise they can be gotten rid of. But if they're parts of you, then you can't as easily get rid of them as you could even to saw off your own arm. That would be a lot easier than taking a part of your mind that you've separated and trying to get rid of that, you know. You have to bring it back in. It's like you've turned a piece of yourself, a coherent part of your own hearth and fire, into one of your Winnipeg homeless people in the heated bus stop who's broken out all the windows, you know, and you've accepted them and put them into a part of your home. But it's like you need to actually put them back into their own home, which is back in your mind as a coherent part of your psyche. But otherwise, I mean, simply say the word, and
Right.
I mean, I'll wipe the slate clean for you. But
Well, no, I mean that's a great offer, and before I accept that offer, which I will, as part of the process of elimination that we discussed, right, and as part of my policy, because like I'm very aware of all the things that you said before you said them, although you elaborated on them and said them better than I could have. But my attitude has always been exactly along the lines of yours. But I do want to clarify one thing, that they do not, live in my home, right? It's just that they are with me wherever I go. So they essentially do indeed live with me or inside of me or just around me at all times. And so the only reason they live in my home is because when I'm at home, they're with me. But when I go outside, they're with me too. So it's not like they're, quote unquote, necessarily may not understand fully the metaphor of the broken homeless, the homeless bus shack's broken or whatever. I even in the concept that they are parts of myself, I actually think it may be a rather valuable thing in that case that I've consciously or unconsciously done here by basically sort of bringing online two different, quite powerful modalities of myself that are useful in different situations as extensions of my will that are outside of the limitations of my one, such as it is, coherent personality or psychology, as what you would call Shogun or Ghost. Because there's certain things that Shogun or Ghost, respectively, are very good at, and other things that they're potentially not so good at, and yet these other beings might be extremely good at. And so if indeed they are extensions of myself, that may not be a bad thing in my thinking. It may actually be one of the more useful things I've perhaps done. But that's just a secondary reflection, and may or may not be accurate. But as for whether or not you can magically rule out demons or hostile ghosts, or possibly even friendly ghosts, if you think that's a good thing to get rid of as well, I would certainly see no reason to reject such an offer.
well, if it turns out to be the case that these are parts of your subconscious that you're now experiencing as externalized beings, then you're basically doing what Jung did in the process of writing the Red Book, which is you are experiencing firsthand archetypes of the unconscious. And that's a process that I just can't even begin to try and put into words, because you can't. You can just describe the way that it happens, right? You can't say, I mean, it's like coming to terms with the totality of consciousness, which is just, what the fuck does that even begin to mean? But if that is the case, then you've been provided with this remarkable gift of an opportunity to process things that most people never even decide to come to terms with in the first place. And if that is in fact what's going on here, then not only should you pursue it, you should pursue it adamantly, and you should read Jung. However, again, I'm dubious, because if you've attached these things to yourself in such and such a way, then they could already just be following you around supernaturally, and irrespective of your relative position. They're just attached to some third or fourth level extension of your, what do they call it, an auric body or whatever. Just, they're orbiting you peripherally. And that's generally the word that I and my fellows use, is orbit, right? And so you've got these things orbiting you, and it's like I said, with the laser and the sheets of cloth, they're just confounding the process of you bringing your soul and will into actuality. So for the record, I think you should immediately approach a scorched earth policy. And if that doesn't work, then you're left with the deep introspection and the revelation of psychological gifts.
And that is honestly
yeah.
where I perceived it to come. I also tried to apply the scorched earth policy in every way that I could. And I suppose you could say I did employ my own form of ceremonial magic to do so. And I can perhaps describe what I did and see whether or not you think it's magically valid from your point of view. Because as I said, I seem to do magic instinctively rather than following a set protocol or process established by someone else. I just seem to have an intuition of how to do magic when I need to do it, and when I need to do it, I do it. In the same way that I do, martial arts or something else, it becomes like an instinctive thing at a certain point, rather than something you could necessarily break down as a step by step. Now, whether that's better or worse or what, I'm not speculating on that. So the point is, I agree we should do a scorched earth policy, and again, because of the potential ramifications of this being some kind of very powerful egregore or servitor, which you talked about in the first place, right? That I could create some kind of rampaging, powerful spiritual entity that escapes my control. That's crossed my mind, and I've thought about that a lot, since it is pretty clear that these entities do have power and can do things in the real world as well as in other worlds and spirit worlds and so forth. And so, yes, I want to continue to not only once, but continuously test these things in the same way that I try to continuously test myself, because I know that I also have the potential to be something quite dangerous if I were to allow myself to be, and so I have to continuously ensure that I don't, and that I'm not unintentionally doing that. And in the same way, I subject these beings, whether they're other parts of myself or whatever they are, to the same standard. You know what I mean? Just to make sure. Rule out any possibility of unleashing a hostile AI, because the potential, metaphorically speaking, right, something that could potentially have unknown whatever. So point is, one,
sure.
I would like you to do whatever you can to rule out any negative possibility. But two, after everything I've done, I have actually come to the Jungian conclusion. I'm by no means an expert in Jung, but that's basically what I've been left with, is that these are indeed parts of myself, which for whatever reason myself is so broad, or whatever the word is, or deep, or whatever the word is, that it is capable of manifesting as multiple of what other people would consider totally coherent personalities in and of themselves, because my psychic spillover just requires me to create these concepts to sort of
Well,
catch
watch it, because the profundity of the spirit is not a singular phenomenon. It is literally present in all points of consciousness.
Of course, but
yeah.
as you know, and as we were discussing in our previous conversation about bipolar disorder and all this stuff, as I said, I'm prone to extremely detailed, intricate, introspective symbolization as a way to try and process internal mental content that would otherwise be ineffable and therefore unprocessable. And so therefore I use language and names and words and concepts to kind of map out my own understanding of self, if that makes sense. And I'm aware that although everyone is infinitely profound in spirit and consciousness, not everyone has that experience or processes their experience in that way. In fact, I've met not too many people who have.
Sure.
Yeah, presuming that's some kind of neurodivergence or whatever you want to call it. But regardless, so point one, I would like you to, I don't know if you mean like you're going to do it now in the process of this podcast, or if you're saying you'll do it later at a later point. I don't know how involved. You said you could do it by just snapping your fingers. So if that be the case, please snap away.
Well, I'm going to try that first. And then if that doesn't work, then I'm going to immediately skip to breaking out the big guns. But usually, I mean, my control of the astral plane is level enough that I can usually just will things into existence and demonstrate a simple action like a snap of the finger. And these things happen so tangentially to the time stream that they can just occur simultaneously or even retroactively. So yeah, here, let's try that. And we'll see if that works. That tends to work for most minor perturbances, but in any case, like on review, things persist, then I'll probably transition to the UFR or the right of the 7 points. Not sure, but I basically I've got like probably 14 grades of intensity that I can employ here, right? And of course, the first one is just attempting to will it away astrally, and it's novel. Some people tap their ring on the table, like the Masons tap their ring on the table. Some guys will snap their fingers for effect. Now, of course, I'm a pompous ass, so I start with that. And the second one is the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. Now, most things don't get above the second grade, but then you can imagine there's 12 grades of intensity above that. So by the time you get to 14, it's like you're literally trying to remove the king of hell from the presence of someone's soul and body, rather definitively. And everything above, I mean, there are things above that, but they require like blood sacrifices and whatever. And I've never found the necessity. But, hypothetically, you could end or begin wars, and crash or inflate the stock market or whatever, and you just have to murder a quadrupedal animal, which I'm generally not willing to do. But yeah, so anyway, blood magic aside, was more than happy to discuss this subject because the next part was, of course, going to be me bloviating about my curriculum vitae on the subject. And I really don't see the need. I mean, but you do whatever. My days of thinking that that's important have since passed. But do you want to open it up to questions from the dwindling audience?
Yeah, sorry for taking so much time, but it's very interesting and valuable to me, and I'm aware that pretty much all of our topics, esotericism, ceremonial magic, really kind of require their own series, and we've done series on the subjects before with Drew and others, but so hopefully we can only scratch the surface in any one particular conversation. So yes, let's absolutely.
I think we should set a statute of like 3 or 4 week touchbacks, right? So when we get to like 3 or 4 weeks after the lost Freemasonry thing, we'll do that again. We get to 3 or 4 weeks on Hermeticism, we're going to try that again. We can just run like a cycle of maybe 4 to 5 subjects that we just run every few weeks, each one of them, and just kind of run them until they're tapped out and then switch one up. Or I think it'll kind of flow naturally, but yeah, you're right. They do kind of require series, but I'm not big on serialization. I think doing something multiple times is fine, but doing it multiple times in a row is sort of arduous. You're likely to repeat yourself and what have you. But in any event, I appreciated the discussion of current events because you did me the perhaps inadvertent favor of making the subject extremely relevant, which is good. But in any case, I'd like to open it up personally, so I think we're going to do that. Just because it's been not quite as long as I think it has, because we didn't actually start at 9 my time, but it's 10 of 11 o'clock here. So anyone, please go right ahead.
If nobody else has questions, I can certainly ask more.
I'll ask a question.
Please do.
Go ahead, please.
So what do you know about ceremonial magic as it relates to like mystics or other religious magicians, like the Sufis? Yeah.
So Tios and I had the distinct pleasure back in the day of engaging in interlocution and discussion. I wouldn't classify it as debate, really, because the Sufis are very classy individuals with whom we never had any conflicts. But we had the distinct pleasure of meeting a number of them. And what I will say is that there's a remarkable parallel, and of course I'd probably be nailed to a wall and shot and then burned for saying this, but there's a remarkable parallel between the Sufi mysticism and the mysticism of the Kabbalah. So, Islam discussed the subject of sins of the tongue, and then in Kabbalah you have this concept of the Ruach, where the vibrations emanating from the vocal cords, so this is, vocalizations, singing, exclamations, just sort of the guttural noises and the groans and moans and grunts and everything, those all comprise the Ruach, which is a seventh part of the soul. So it's 1/7 of your soul is actually just your emanations from the breath. And so the Sufis, for instance, will come in groups, and then you'll ask them a question, and they will withdraw to discuss among themselves their answer. And then they will return and pronounce their answer, so as they've premeditated in order to avoid committing sins of the tongue. So there's an immediate parallel in that great power is given to the word. And of course, Christians above all else ascribe power to the word because the Logos came to the world as man, and was the living representation of the Word of God. So, frankly, I'm not familiar with the specifically ceremonial practices of the Sufis, and I don't understand how I ever would be, considering that I believe it's kind of a closed culture. And of course, I'm not like one of these Shahada reciting people who's actually going to accept Muhammad as my guiding principle. Muhammad, peace be upon him. But I'm not going to, pronounce my commitment to Allah as he's understood in Islam.
I was just curious about the origins of most of your ceremonial magic knowledge, and was asking about, yeah.
The only concern I have, Constantine, when people, or Constantine's bunny, when people come in and ask questions, I usually like them to have heard the podcast from the beginning, because otherwise the likelihood that the question you're asking has already been answered prior to your arrival is high.
She was here.
Okay. Because
she dropped out for about 10 minutes, but she was here the whole time.
If you haven't answered that question, and you feel you have a different answer or an answer, please, by all means.
No, I don't think necessarily that I gave we'll call it a bibliography, right? I don't think that I did that during any point here. I think what you may be referring to is the beginning of this discussion, where I described a number of the major influences who you had referenced. But so in response, sorry.
No, I'm sorry.
In response to your question directly, I consider myself a Hermeticist, right? So an esotericist following the practice and doctrine of Hermeticism. And as a result, I believe in the perennialist nature of the central truth. So it's been expressed through hundreds and probably tens of thousands of sources over the entire history of humanity, many of which we probably lost in the Library of Alexandria, and we may well have lost all the records of Atlantis if it ever existed. But you have to understand that there is a central truth, and that no matter how badly you lie, your lie is still merely a shadow of the extant truth. So, we say all truths are but half-truths, but as a result, even if lies are only an eighth true, all lies are partially true as well. So you go forth and pick the meat off of the bones of everything, and this is sort of the mysterious tradition of inquiry as it has been passed down across the ages. And you see this among the high priests of Assyria and Babylon, and then you see it extend into the ancients in Egypt and North Africa, and you even begin to notice parallels in the native religions of Japan, Greece, and the Roman religion, which partially descended from the Greek religion. And you look at the Norse pantheon, the Hellenic pantheon, of course, I already mentioned. You look at the primal religions of Africa that have originated from the tribes. There's a number of them, the Native Americans, of course. Then you get into the major world religions. You look at Kabbalah, you look at Sufism, and you'll find that there's literally a central truth expressed. And so the Hermetic initiatory hierarchy tends to be the one that is dedicated to the central, truthful interpretation of all of these sources simultaneously, as opposed to the ascription to any particular one. And that's the tradition I tend to follow. And of course, this is represented in the works of a number of initiatic hierarchies. It's represented in the York Rite of Freemasonry. If you're interested in the esoteric side of interpretation, it's also present in Blue Lodge Freemasonry. Ceremonial magic, you could argue, is present at the Mass. It's present in the rituals of fire that have preceded all well-defined and terminologically valid religion. I mean, man began to circumambulate in imitation of the rotation of the sun around the earth so early as he could make fire. And so the idea of ritualized practice is something that goes all the way up into business. You know, they talk about the power of habits and everything. It's like, well, you establish a ritual, and that ritual has effects, so you keep doing it because you enjoy the effects of it, right? They're good effects. So it's just anything like that. And the belief of ceremonial magic is that some of these rituals and habits and practices have qualitative effects, which can be quantified even, which are not physically explicable. They are not a direct result of your actions. Like, you know, I fucking wave my arms in the air and recite these word names of various spirits and invoke them in a certain procedure with astral visualizations, and in no wise does that then influence the medical state of a human being 400 miles away. But at the same time, I do the thing, and then it presents this miraculous change in the individual's biological status. So, I mean, that's basically where it comes from. So the tradition is called scientific illuminism, and Crowley coined it as the method of science, the aim of religion. And it's the idea that you take this transcendental knowledge, and rather than just presenting it as, what do we call it? UPG, unverified personal gnosis. UPG is basically what you find when people come in with their half-baked quantum theories and their specific proprietary system of magic or whatever, and they proclaim it to be this universal truth. It's called unverified personal gnosis. So you get all these people who come together with their UPG, and you get the specific correspondence between each of them. You pull out the mutualistic points and the overlaps and everything, and then you attempt to turn that into a part of the whole coherent circle. And that's the whole idea, is to build the circle, you know, the infinitude. You can never actually complete it, because if you did, you'd be God, and no one will ever be God but God. So Hermeticism is sort of an attempt to form a coherent understanding instead of a limited, dogmatic, or dictatorial one. And that's the position that I come from, anyway.
Thank you for your question. Does anyone, and your answer, does anyone else have a question? Mr. Eggbased? I do have one more, but it's possible that we could just carry it on to the conversation after. You think we should wrap it up at this point, or if anyone else?
I sincerely think that we should put out the offer for people to ask questions, and then actually give it more than just a brief and concise count of 3, because everybody's been on mute for like a fucking hour and a half. So
no, I'm not saying people can't ask a question, and people do have time to think about one and ask one now.
Well, if you think yours would be illustrative, then I would say ask it, perhaps give somebody else a chance, and then ask it afterwards. But otherwise, if it's, again, of that personal nature, then we can address it afterwards. That would be fine.
No more personal than anything else I've talked about today. But again, does anyone have a question for Mr. Eggbased?
Can I just ask, is it called scientific illumination?
I'm going to tag you in general chat with the link. Okay?
Okay.
So going once, questions? Going twice. Going thrice, with the caveat that you can still think of a question and ask one if perhaps you need some time to formulate one.
Going 3.5 times.
I can perhaps ask mine if you want, and then we'll see if people think of one. Going 4
Shit,
times.
man, go nuts.
Okay, well, I thought it might be illustrative for you to, hear something that I did with a sort of instinctive sense that it was akin to ritual magic, but again, with the understanding or ceremonial magic that it's, like you said, it's not an established thing. It's just something I kind of did on my own, right? And then so you can tell me whether you think this would have been helpful in any way or harmful perhaps, or just irrelevant. But, as you said, in the interest of pursuing this like scorched earth policy with these entities, and as you know, I researched heavily the concept of anathematization and was very fascinated by what that meant and its various contradictory meanings and complex meanings. But ultimately, what I understood it is to dedicate something to God through destruction is one way to phrase it, or to destroy something in the name of God as an offering to God, right? It can have many different complex meanings. One of the weirdest words I've ever come across. I'm always intrigued by things like that. So anyways, I wrote the name, right, that had been revealed to me, the 3-part name or whatever. I drew an image that had been sort of represented to me. And basically what I did is I took a chalice that's significant to me, a grail of sorts, whatever you want to call it, a cup, a chalice. And I had actually, I guess I did find this process. I didn't come to me completely intuitively, actually. I did, strangely enough, read it in a book that my mother had, which I had randomly or not so randomly pulled off the shelf and opened to one page, and randomly or not so randomly read that page and read something akin to this and then kind of modified it a little bit. But basically the idea here was sort of akin to like Abraham and Isaac or whatever, in the sense that like I'm going to offer this thing completely to God and allow God to destroy it if any part of it is not in compliance with God's will or God's intention, right? And I wasn't willing to put what may have been a part of myself, as you said, or perhaps a ghost or some other spiritual being through that if I wasn't willing to do it also to myself. And so I applied the same process to myself, essentially. But not exactly the same of like writing my name and burning it, but in a different sense. Again, the point being here that if I'm unsure what this thing is, I'll give it to God and ask him to destroy anything he doesn't like, including me, and whatever's left is potentially not in opposition to him. And so again, the ritual part of it was quite simple. It was drawing a picture on a piece of paper and writing the name, placing it in the chalice and burning it. And indeed, it all burned except for a small part at the bottom, precisely large enough to contain the name. So the whole image burned away, but left just enough paper without me putting it out. It just naturally went out and left this little piece with the room for the name. So my interpretation of that was, like, I guess that I'm just describing it. Did that to you meet any of the criteria of ceremonial magic, or is that something entirely different? And either way, do you have any insight into whether or not that was a useful thing to do?
Well, it depends, and this is where I begin to cop out. It depends on the nature of the spirit. Okay? Because if I have a significant demon, right, that is, attempting to influence somebody I know or care about, who lights something on fire and a certain amount of it burns away and a certain amount of it doesn't, then that's one thing. But, of course, angels and fire, it's a whole separate thing. I don't know. So, it could very well go one way or the other. I don't think it's nearly as informative as you hoped it would be. But, yeah, that one could very easily swing either way. It definitely does point towards preternatural entities or supernatural entities, as opposed to just disembodied human spirits. It speaks to like a spiritual entity, like an entirely metaphysical being that was not embodied directly. So that may or may not be good news, may in fact be bad news to you, but again, I cannot express strongly enough that the main tool that is of use in this process will be discernment by investigation. So good luck with that.
Thank you. So now that people have had one more chance, does anyone have a question?
I do. So, Eggbased, you were mentioning that if it is not anything external to him, and it may be something that is a part of him, and that would be extremely difficult.
Hold on,
to get rid
Kashega.
of.
Hold on.
Mhm.
You said the
Okay.
word if, and then I lost probably about 5 or 6 words after that. So please go ahead and express yourself more fully. I apologize.
No worries. So, if this is something that is a part of him, you're saying that could be the most, like, an extremely difficult thing for him to do, to get rid of it or to integrate all those pieces. Do you have any suggestions as to how he could proceed to do that for himself?
Yes, absolutely.
shadow?
So that's a fantastic question, by the way. Thank you so much. It's very evident to me that you were paying attention for a great deal of that conversation, which is remarkably flattering. I take it as a fantastic compliment because I could never possibly hope to listen to someone such as myself for such an extended period of time.
I did.
But yes, and God love you for that. But yeah, so in response, as concisely as I possibly can, which, as you very well know by now, is not concisely at all. The way in which to integrate these things is literally to treat them as divisions of the self, and to understand that each one of these things is a distinct impression. It's a distinct aspect of your personality. And it has, as such, drives and origins and desires, and it has a certain degree of will and capacity for expression within the confines of yourself. And so you need to understand these things as a feasible alternative to whatever fault or void you have in your mind, or your self-dialogue, right? Or your monologue, I guess, right? Is that these extensions of the subconscious, of the personality, or of archetypes of the self or the unconscious would, in fact, not be expressing themselves had you already integrated the ideas that they represent or the aspects that they represent. As a result, you need to put a great deal of work into rectifying that situation, because the alternative is that you will never get those parts of yourself back. So when I have had to do this, speaking from personal experiences, the idea is generally to understand what the entity actually represents, and then how and why it is dissatisfied or longing or yearning or separate, and then resolve that. And this is actually, it connects directly to Buddhism, because the Buddhists believe, at least in Theravada and Vajrayana, that you should view all of your emotions and longings and wants and desires as an external being, and then address them as such and say, well, what do you want? What is wrong? Like, why do you exist? What is your purpose? And they'll tell you. Like, you can literally look at parts of yourself as separate beings and ask them, what the fuck is up in the place to be? And just say, like, what do you want from me? What is so important that you have decided to distinguish yourself as a separate experience from my coherent self. And most of the time, so long as you're already involved in having a communicative dialogue with these entities, they'll answer you directly if they're parts of you. And they'll tell you why they're separate and what they want and what their purpose for existence is, raison d'être. They'll tell you these things. And they will, in their best and greatest wise, attempt to resolve any sort of disagreement between your essence and theirs. So that would be a great place to start. Just ask them, like, if you're a part of me, why are you now separate? How do I fix this? And they'll tell you. If they're actually part of you, they'll tell you directly. But yeah.
To your knowledge, are you aware of if there are any kind of ceremonies or anything that a person could do to help that process along for themselves?
Well, that sort of goes beyond the realm of ceremonial magic and kind of regresses back into just meditative practice. Because it's all in the mind. It's actually a directly first-person experience of the mind. So I believe clearing away external influences is extremely valuable to that process. You should be banishing and invoking regularly, but only in so far wise that it affects your ability to enter deep meditative states. Now, of course, if you have complete control over the astral plane, which most people do not, you can simply remove your awareness from any sort of external influence. And in that case, you really don't need to, banish or dismember any sort of proximal spirits. You can just enter a deep state of meditation and ignore them. But it may well bring you some quietude to remove those external influences. So I can recommend that fairly strongly. But for the record, if you have disembodied parts of your soul, spirit, or mind, the only way you're going to get at them is by really entering a deep state of thought.
So thank you for the question, Kashika, especially as it was more or less for my benefit, indirectly or directly. And thank you also for your answer for that reason. This conversation has been very valuable to me because, as I said, this has been one, as you know, I'm a man of many obsessions, but this has probably been the foremost among them recently for the reasons we've discussed. And although this conversation has gone in different directions with that, I think on balance of evidence or on balance of the conversation, it's led me to what I had already concluded independently, but sort of been a confirming opinion to some extent, or it's helped me to confirm the opinion that this is indeed some kind of like Jungian psychological thing, is the best way, most productive way, the most interesting way, probably the most valuable way to approach it, and probably the most close to the truth, if such a term can be used in such a situation as truth. But certainly I'm not ruling out the other two possibilities entirely yet, but it seems to me that this is the best way to explain it, especially in line of what you said, which is like if you ask them a question, they'll just directly answer it, and you can literally just talk to them. And that's my experience of this. Literally, like I can just have full out conversations with these different things, and they can also converse back with me, but they're not, they're not acting like demons in the goetic description that you've given, right? It's not really conforming to that aspect of it. So it's been interesting, but I think that's where I'm leaning towards, especially as you've now added one more check to my list of safety protocols around this by doing whatever it is that you did magically. So that should either resolve the issue if it is an issue, and that's the thing too. It's like I'm kind of presenting this as though it's inherently a problem. I'm becoming increasingly less convinced that it is inherently problematic. Because it may be the case that it's actually some kind of useful psychological construct that I'm employing, or a necessary psychological mechanism of some kind, that isn't necessarily a problem in and of itself. It would only be a problem if it is indeed some kind of, demon or attachment or something, then that would be inherently problematic. I'm not inherently opposed to the concept that I may have bifurcated or trifurcated, and when you open that up, there's more than that, because these are entities that I'm bringing up because they present themselves as though they are in some sense external to me, whereas I have other completely distinct personalities that manifest, but they manifest as internal to me. So some of you, not many perhaps, have met quote unquote Lucas Valencourt. It's totally different accent, different voice, different personality, different memories, everything. But I experience him as like someone who walks into me, who is in some sense like, it's a different experience than when I talk to Angel and Rose, who present themselves as being outside of me. So that's why I'm confused. Because if indeed what I'm talking about here are variations in my own personality, then that means there's a lot more than just the two of them, right? Then I'd have to account for at least two more. But anyways, I appreciate very much your insights and information. We'll maybe open it up one more time for questions, and then you can make any closing statements you might like to make.
What's your thoughts on things like energy work or like spiritual energy or like stuff like that with the energy centers of the body?
All right. Hi, Boop.
Hello?
Energy work. So the way I interpret that is that you're discussing something about chakras, meridians, Reiki, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to again state that this is a vast star field of that ranges from utter, abjectly counterproductive nonsense of spiritual healing that can never be achieved. And insofar as that is the case, I will tell you that it's a total crapshoot, and that there are people who know exactly what they're doing, who are fantastic at it, but that externally they are often indistinguishable from the people who are very, very good, and those who are also very, very bad and could do you a great deal of harm. So I have some watchwords that I look out for, and one of them is like sacred fire Reiki master. It's like, what does that mean? Theoretically, there's some school that judges your ability to do those things. But some of the women I've met who are certified sacred fire Reiki masters are like some of the most energetically impure, like syphilitic women ever, who have like terrible like disease and infections all the time, and like just have these remarkably unclean influences in their life at all times. And so it becomes like a physician heal thyself thing, and like a ye will know them by their fruits thing, where a lot of these energy workers are working from their energetic position, and a lot of the time they're not holistically responsible practitioners. So they think they can just heal somebody from a position of unhealth, and that they can extend help to somebody else that they won't give themselves. And I don't even have to explain how completely erroneous that is, right? But yeah, I'm not saying the practice is illegitimate, but what I am definitively stating, without any equivocation, is that just like any other thing that is so easily commercialized, the better services are generally going to be either vastly more expensive or vastly less expensive. And everyone in the middle is pretty much just trying to make a buck. Because the people at the top know what they've got, or they know what they've got and they know not to charge for it. Because that's simony, right? You should never sell what is holy. You do buy the truth, but never sell it. And so I don't know. I mean, I personally think you can do most of your energy work on your own unless you're a fucking moron. I think that comes with spiritual cognizance. But, that's me being a remarkably judgmental gatekeeper, so I don't know how useful an answer that is. But
I see.
Thank you for your question and answer. I think perhaps it's around the time we should begin wrapping up, if you're okay with that. Do you have any closing statements you might like to leave with the audience?
I'm going to give it one last chance. Anybody else with a burning question that you want answered on the recording?
Last call, everybody.
Going once.
How would you tell the difference between like the presence of a spirit or if it was another person, if they like projected their energy body to you?
All right,
So
and that'll be the end. So the difference is generally that I don't know how to explain it, but you can tell whether something that's contacting you is alive, on the earth, or dead. And the way is generally in the same sense that you can tell if someone's in the room with you even while you have your back turned, right? So if someone's in the room with you and you were hypothetically blind and deaf, and you face the wall away from them, if they stand up and leave the room, there is some faculty that you possess that if you're in tune with it enough, you can tell that they've gone. And much in that same way, you can tell if a living person's essence is in the room with you. I don't know how to explain it, but what I do know is insofar as you can practice asana and pranayama, you can discern the presence of a living human being over a disembodied spirit.
Okay.
thank you for the question, Boop. Thank you again, Eggbased. And again, do you have a closing statement you'd like to make or a message?
Sure.
Take home.
Sure. What I'd like to say, it's sort of obligatory, is that this is the most potent and powerful practical form of applied spirituality in all of existence so far as I understand it. It is ceremonial magic is a term so poorly defined that it could be holistically and honestly applied to just about any form of prescribed action, up to and including courting, flirtation, cooking, sleeping at night, brushing your teeth. You know, you could call any of those forms of ceremonial magic, but where it begins to become this transcendental and metaphysical expression of esoteric principles is when you get beyond. So I'd like to really impress that as the definition, is that ceremonial magic is a prescribed set of actions and behaviors with a specific intent that have effects, allegedly, beyond their physical implications. And I'd like everybody to just accept the fact that that is not only possible, or not only plausible, but that it is in fact a real phenomenon that exists. And that's a hard pill to swallow at some point. But you know, Hitler and Churchill and Eisenhower and all these great and fantastic world leaders of the Second World War all had a private group of practitioners and astrologers. There are books on the subject, and needless to say that every leader before them had the same. Queen Elizabeth had John Dee, who channeled the entirety of Enochian into being, which is still studied and ill understood to this day. I mean, I've thrown countless hours at it, and in the meantime have had friends die horribly while making mistakes or misguided efforts in that study. I've had friends die horribly attempting to practice certain esoteric forms of spiritual magic that, or ceremonial magic that interfaced with spirits they did not fully understand or were attempting to utilize in some erroneous or misguided way. And that this is in no wise an over-dramatization of events, that I come to you honestly and say that this is a matter of grave importance that no one should embark on lightly or even at all. You will find people, in fact, who will tell you not to ever do it. One, because you shouldn't, and two, because if you really, really were going to and were dedicated to it, no one could dissuade you from it. And that was certainly the case with me, as I was warned and warned and warned again and again. I continued inquiring and continued acquiring, and eventually I proved that the aim of my soul was good and that I could survive doing these things because I earnestly sought the truth and earnestly applied my practical knowledge for the benefit of others. And that is the only grace by which I've been saved from the merciless death of so many of my colleagues and associates. So proceed with caution, but know in your heart that the soul has agency in the world, and that the application of that agency in a very refined and definite way is no less useful than physical discipline, exercise, employment, or any other form of procedure and rules and policy. It is simply as essential, but it is an extension of the soul in that respect. And so long as you're out of touch with the soul, it will have no value to you. And that is, I believe, a firm closing statement. Thank you.
It was an excellent closing statement, an excellent podcast as always. Thank you very much as well for your time, Eggbased, and everybody for listening and your questions. As always, I have many more things I would like to get into with you, and that's why we've made it a weekly thing. So if you've enjoyed this, as I'm sure you have, be aware that Eggbased is now appearing every Friday at 8 p.m. Central on the podcast on various subjects related or otherwise to this one. Everything's related in some way. So thanks again, Eggbased. Thanks, everybody. And this and all podcasts can be found on the Temple Mount Discord server, Temple Mount YouTube channel, podcasts on BitChute and YouTube as well. That being said,
And thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. God bless.
And don't take the mark of the beast.
Indeed do not. Good night, everybody.